It was supposed to be a show of strength. Tanks rolled, flags flew, helicopters thundered above Constitution Avenue, as if the skies themselves had something to prove. The cameras never left him. Donald Trump, seated in a gold-trimmed golf cart, waving like a king. But while the streets echoed with forced applause, one voice was already rising. Not louder, just sharper. Calm, precise, cutting straight through the noise. And when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped to the mic and said, he needed tanks to feel tall, America didn't just hear her. It stopped. What followed wasn't just a reaction. It was a reckoning. Not because it was rehearsed, but because it was real. The morning came heavy, not with rain or clouds, but with that quiet kind of weight DC wears when it's trying too hard to look important. June 14th, Flag Day. And by no coincidence, the former president's 79th birthday. The air hung thick over Constitution Avenue, the kind of heat that made people shift in their shoes and wipe the back of their necks before they had even found a place to stand. They came because the posters told them something big was happening, something historic. A celebration of 250 years of the United States Army, the invitation had said, but looking around, not everyone seemed certain what exactly they were clapping for. The tanks came first, wide, slow, and groaning against the asphalt. Then the helicopters, circling tight like nervous birds above the rooftops. The sounds were all there, powerful, practiced, but the feeling underneath didn't quite match. The music stumbled slightly. A high school band from Indiana marched behind one of the armored columns, but their rhythm was just a little off. A trumpet cracked on a high note. Someone in the crowd clapped once, then stopped. At the center of it all, moving slower than the rest, was a golf cart dressed up like something it wasn't. Gold trim, a red cushion, a little flag fluttering from the back, and sitting inside it, waving steadily with his fingers spread wide, was Donald Trump. The smile never left his face, but it didn't quite touch his eyes. He didn't salute, he just waved, over and over, like a man expecting the world to wave back. Some did, some didn't. Others just watched, unsure of what they were witnessing. Toward the edge of the sidewalk, an older couple stood hand in hand. The woman squinted into the sun. Her husband leaned on a walking cane, a veteran's pin clipped to the brim of his cap. "Doesn't feel like it's for the troops," she said quietly. He nodded once but said nothing. Not far from them, a group of young Marines stood in quiet formation. One of them, barely more than a boy, shifted his weight, then stepped back. He didn't say anything, just walked away. Not out of protest, not out of disrespect. It was more like his presence there had started to feel misplaced. And then came the signs. They weren't everywhere, but they were there if you looked. "Honor vets, not vanity," one read, held by a woman sitting cross-legged on the grass, a photo tucked between her knees. Another simply said, $45 million. How many VA beds is that? Some stood in silence. Others leaned against trees, watching quietly. No shouting, just stillness with a message. A child tugged at his father's sleeve. "Are we supposed to cheer?" he asked. The man gave a soft shrug and lifted him up for a better view. The parade moved on. More tanks, more noise. But the energy never quite caught. It felt like something that had been built big enough to impress a camera, but not a crowd. And through it all, Trump kept waving, calm, composed, as if the entire performance was going exactly as he'd imagined it. But not everyone was convinced. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the barricades and past the news vans, someone was watching. Not for the spectacle, but for the story hidden inside it. Watching quietly, taking note. Because sometimes it's not the fireworks or the flags that start something. It's the questions they leave behind. And this time, one of those questions was about to find its way into the hands of someone who knew exactly what to do with it. The apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the window unit, trying its best against the June heat. A half-finished plate of arroz con gandules sat on the coffee table, cold now, next to a glass of melting ice water. AOC sat cross-legged on the worn couch, her laptop perched on one knee, a muted live stream replaying the Flag Day parade in soft loops. No sound, just movement and close-ups and wide angles that tried too hard. She had seen it live earlier, like everyone else. But this time, without the noise, something else began to rise to the surface. It wasn't just what was shown, it was what was chosen, the angles, the pacing, the editing. She leaned in. The camera zoomed slowly on Trump, seated like a centerfold of power, not surrounded by soldiers, but by suited donors, familiar faces from past fundraisers. In another shot, you could see them rearranging people along the route, subtly but deliberately. Young children in patriotic shirts brought closer to the frame. A man in a wheelchair wearing a vet cap nudged out of it. She reached for a pen. No paper. Her eyes darted to the side table. She pulled a yellow post-it from the stack, wrote 3 words. This isn't patriotism. This is optics. She stared at the note for a moment, then stuck it to the side of her laptop. Not as a slogan, just a thought. One of many. She'd been raised to pay attention to things others look past. Her abuela used to say, Las verdades pequeñas se esconden en los gestos más grandes. The smallest truths hide in the biggest gestures. In this parade, it was a gesture so big it practically begged not to be questioned. She leaned back, took a sip of water, let the condensation trail over her fingers. The screen showed helicopters now, swooping in tight formations over the National Mall. There was applause in the background, but no real joy in the faces. Just the kind of polite clapping that feels more like social obligation than celebration. Then, a knock, not loud, just 2 taps against the door. She rose without hurry, glanced at the clock just after 8 p.m., and opened it to find her staffer Elijah, still in his work shirt, holding a slim stack of mail. Late drop, he said with a small shrug. Mostly junk, but this was on top. He handed her a manila envelope, thick paper, no return address. Just 1 word stamped in red across the front. Confidential, no name, no seal, no context. She tilted her head, turning it over. It didn't feel like a donation letter or an advocacy brief. It felt heavier somehow, like something someone had decided they needed her to see, but couldn't say out loud. Want me to vet it? Elijah asked gently. She shook her head. Not yet. He nodded and left her with the rest of the stack. Flyers, circulars, a handwritten card from a 5th grader in Queens thanking her for visiting their school. She smiled softly, laid the card beside her food, and carried the envelope to her desk. She didn't open it right away. First, she shut her laptop, turned off the replay, cleared the dishes. It wasn't about dramatics, just rhythm. She had learned over the years that sometimes the truth needed a little space before it spoke clearly. When she finally sat down and sliced open the seal, the contents slipped out like breath. Thin, folded papers, dense with briefing language, highlighted in places she didn't recognize. There was a timestamp, a department header, and at the top of the first page, a line that stopped her cold. Ensure lead camera shots favor president's positioning. Secondary crowd visuals to be composed of pre-selected supporters. She blinked, then read it again. Not out loud, not yet, but something shifted behind her ribs. So it wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't just her. It was written, directed, and carefully managed. She folded the page again, slowly, and looked at the envelope sitting there like it had been waiting for her all along. Sometimes, she thought, the truth doesn't knock. It slips through in quiet paper and asks, now that you know, what will you do with it? She read the memo slowly, once without blinking, then again with a pencil in hand, underlining, circling, scribbling small notes in the margins. It wasn't long, maybe 5 or 6 pages, but it didn't need to be. The words spoke louder than their format. They didn't shout, but they didn't hide either. They didn't bother with diplomacy. They just assumed no one outside the room would ever read them. The document carried a White House Communications Office header, and beneath it the words, confidential, internal strategy, brief, event ID, #FD 2025. It was dated just 3 weeks before the parade. Most of the paragraphs were short, bullet points, talking strategy, but not the kind of strategy meant for national unity. Her eyes caught on the phrases that felt heavier than the paper they were printed on. Donor zones camera preferred. Ensure visibility of target influencers along primary press lanes. Segment coordination to favor audience engagement over military sequence integrity. No Pentagon clearance required for unit presentation adjustments. She paused there. No Pentagon clearance? She leaned back slightly, let the page rest on her lap. That one line lingered longer than the rest. She knew what it implied. Not just ego, but override. Not just staging, but sidestepping standard protocols. There were always rumors about who got to stand where, who got seated near whom at these public ceremonies. But to see it outlined so cleanly, without shame, almost as if it were routine, it made something quiet inside her stiffen. She flipped to the next page. A chart showed the proposed press camera placements for major networks. Each was labeled primary shot, POTUS, secondary, crowd approval, tertiary, military personnel, children. Someone had highlighted a note at the bottom in bright yellow. Emotional optics key to visual narrative. Minimize exposure of dissenting signage. She didn't need to guess what that meant. She had seen the signs in the crowd. Quiet, hand-painted, brave. And now here they were, planned around. Her fingers tapped once, twice against the paper's edge. The city outside her window still hummed. Distant traffic, faint music, someone dragging a trash bin over pavement. The world was moving along as if nothing had changed. But something had. Still, she didn't reach for her phone. Didn't text anyone. Didn't record a video. Instead, she pulled her old black notebook from the shelf, the one she kept for when something didn't sit right, but wasn't ready to be spoken. She opened to a blank page and wrote slowly, with a pen that made a faint scratch against the paper. Let them talk first, then we bring the receipts. She let the pen rest across the binding and closed the cover gently, like closing a door that didn't need to slam to be heard. This wasn't about striking first. She knew how that looked. Too reactive, too performative. And that wasn't what the moment needed. Let the commentary come. Let the speeches roll out. Let the headlines guess. She would wait, because what she held now wasn't a reaction. It was a record. She slipped the memo back into the envelope and tucked it into her desk drawer beneath a stack of constituent letters. Some were thank you notes from nurses and union workers. One was a hand-drawn card from a second grader in Queens. She smiled faintly, then turned off the desk lamp. The memo would wait, but not for long, because when the time came, it wouldn't need embellishment, it wouldn't need outrage, it would only need daylight. And that, she had learned, was always the part they forgot to plan for. The studio lights weren't harsh, just consistent, flat, almost calming in their artificial warmth. AOC had been in rooms like this before, with mugs that no one really drank from and chairs that looked softer on screen than they felt. It was the last segment of the hour, the kind that usually floats under the radar. The lower third still read, Representative Ocasio-Cortez on inflation, labor, and food access. The host, Keisha Bramwell, was professional and measured, sharp, but not combative. Their conversation had moved at a steady pace. Grocery prices, wage stagnation, supply chain hangovers. The kind of segment that was informative, maybe even helpful, but unlikely to clip well for social media. AOC answered clearly but without theater. She spoke the way she always tried to, like she was talking to someone folding laundry with the TV on. Direct, grounded, just enough pause to let it land. No slogans, no sound bites. Just what she believed. As they wrapped up, the host glanced at the producer behind the glass, probably a cue for 30 seconds left, and smiled. Well, before we let you go, Keisha said, a casual turn in her tone, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask, any thoughts on the parade this weekend? AOC blinked just once. Not surprised, just deciding. She could have deflected, said it wasn't her focus, thanked the host and moved on. But there was something in her chest that hadn't settled since she read that memo, and she didn't feel like holding her breath anymore. She sat up a little straighter, not performatively, just grounded, and spoke softly, almost like she was still in her living room watching the replay with the sound off. We spent $45 million on a birthday parade with tanks, she said, while veterans sleep under bridges. No change in tone, no rising voice, just the plainness of it. That's not patriotism, that's a performance. For a second, the studio was still. Not tense, just still. The kind of pause that doesn't ask for reaction. It creates one. Keisha's eyebrows lifted, ever so slightly. She gave a polite nod, then moved to close the segment, her voice shifting into outro mode. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time. AOC nodded back with a quiet smile. Thank you. The camera feed faded back to the studio desk, and just like that, it was done. But the silence from the control room didn't match the rhythm of a typical sign-off. A producer was already leaning into a headset. The show's social media team was whispering to one another behind their screens. Back in her dressing room, AOC reached for her phone. 3 unread texts, 2 from Elijah. That was clean. They're clipping it already. And one from her cousin in Brooklyn that just said, "Damn." She didn't reply. She just sat still for a moment, watching the replay loop with captions turned on. And when her line came back around, "That's not patriotism. That's a performance." She noticed something. She hadn't even planned to say it. It had just come out the way truth sometimes does. Quiet, simple, undeniable. She leaned back, phone in her lap. Let the rest unfold how it would, because she hadn't come looking for a headline. But sometimes the moment finds you before you even realize you've stepped into it. And this one had just begun. It started the way these things always do, quietly. No explosion, no dramatic moment, just a blink, a pause, a few seconds of stillness after a sentence that felt a little too honest for TV. The host blinked, caught between surprise and professionalism, then continued with her wrap-up like nothing had happened. But something had. It just hadn't reached full volume yet. In the control room, someone marked the segment for clipping, just in case. Someone else flagged the time code, 43 minutes and 28 seconds. A junior staffer pulled the quote and typed it into a caption generator, not because they were told to, but because they felt it in their chest. There was something about how she'd said it. Calm, without venom, like she was stating the obvious while everyone else had been avoiding it. By the time AOC had stepped out of the building and into the back seat of a rideshare, the clip was already uploaded to the show's official Twitter. Just the line in her face, composed, steady, eyes locked forward, no dramatic music, no flashing headlines, just, "We spent $45 million on a birthday parade with tanks while veterans sleep under bridges." That's not patriotism. That's a performance. She didn't check her phone. Not right away. She was thinking about dinner, wondering if she still had leftover lentil stew at home. She liked this time of evening, the in-between space where nothing was urgent, where the day had already said what it needed to say. But the internet had its own timing. Within 30 minutes, the clip had been shared over 1,000 times, not by bots or news aggregators, but by people, real people. Teachers, nurses, veterans, single parents. One retweet simply said, "I've been waiting for someone to say this out loud." By 9 p.m., 3 hashtags were rising at the same time. Hashtag ParadeGate, hashtag Confetti Commander, hashtag Truth Over Tanks. By 10:30, they were trending nationally. A community college professor in Pennsylvania posted, "This is what public service sounds like. Clear, grounded, no theatrics, just truth." A retired Marine from Texas reposted the clip and wrote, "That hit different. We wore those boots. She sees us." A middle school civics teacher in Oregon played the video for her class the next morning. One student asked if they could write a response letter. By midnight, even late-night comedians were quoting the line. Glenn Marks, known for never letting an opportunity go unpunched, opened his monologue with a photo of Trump in his parade cart. "When your parade looks more like a birthday party at a tank museum," he said, "don't be surprised when someone calls it what it is." The audience roared. Then he played the clip. Twice. And then, just as quickly, the clip jumped platforms. Instagram Reels, TikTok stitches, text threads between co-workers, Discord groups. Private Facebook feeds where people rarely posted about politics suddenly started sharing a 14-second video with captions like, "Exactly this. Say it again." I didn't know I needed to hear this, but I did. AOC wasn't watching the numbers. She didn't care about the algorithms, but her staff did. Elijah texted her a screenshot of the analytics dashboard, 1.3 million views in under 4 hours. His message just said, "We're not in control of this anymore." She replied with a thumbs up. Nothing else. Because she hadn't said it to go viral. She'd said it because it was true. And apparently a whole lot of people had been waiting for truth to show up without a costume. What no one knew, not yet, was that the clip wasn't even the biggest part of the story. It was just the spark. The paper was still in her drawer. The memo, the markings, the receipts, all of it waiting. The country was listening now, and she was still quiet, but not for long. The morning unfolded like most others, sun rising gently over palm trees, the hum of sprinklers in quiet neighborhoods, and the world slowly coming back online. But in one corner of Florida, something less gentle had already begun. At 6:42 a.m., a post went up. Then another. Then three more. AOC hates our military. Disgrace to Congress. Ungrateful left mocks America. All capital letters. Sharp, loud, familiar. The kind of fury that felt more rehearsed than real. It wasn't the first time he'd reacted this way. It likely wouldn't be the last. But today there was something slightly different in the air. Not in his tone. His tone was the same, but in how the country received it. Within the hour, the usual voices picked it up. Morning talk shows, conservative radio, familiar cable segments. There was plenty of commentary. A handful of hosts wagged their fingers at the screen, demanding apologies or consequences. A few tried to reframe her words, accused her of disrespecting soldiers, twisting patriotism. Some even held printed quotes from the clip, as if showing it enough times might undo the words. But even as the noise grew, it didn't feel sharp. It felt automatic, like something they were used to doing, whether it worked or not. And AOC, she stayed quiet. At her desk in the district office, the morning was like any other. A small stack of constituent mail waited to be read. A post-it reminder about a community health center visit sat at the corner of her planner. The coffee on her desk had already cooled, forgotten mid-sip. Elijah entered without knocking, holding a tablet and a cautious smile. "He's up," he said simply. She looked up, not startled, not concerned. "Let me guess," or she said. "All caps?" Elijah nodded. "Anything new?" "Same chords, just louder." She reached for a pen, uncapped it slowly, and kept reading the letter in front of her. It was from a nurse in the Bronx, thanking her for voting on a recent housing bill. Simple, clear, real. Elijah lingered. "You sure we shouldn't say something?" She glanced at him, her voice quiet but firm. "Let them talk first." He waited. She added more gently this time. "We haven't even started yet." He nodded once and stepped out. She didn't need the internet to tell her what was happening. She'd seen it before. How quickly outrage could become the distraction. How the people who yelled the loudest weren't always the ones who listened the most. What mattered to her wasn't what they were saying now. It was what they were trying to drown out. And yet the clip was still moving on its own. Not pushed by a campaign, not packaged with graphics or slogans. Just shared by people who saw something in it that felt honest. A teacher in Chicago had reposted it early that morning. She said it like she meant it, and I felt it. A veteran in Nevada, been waiting for someone to say that for years. It was still spreading, not like a wildfire, but like roots. Quiet, steady, real. And while some filled the air with anger and noise, she was still choosing to listen first, to watch, to wait. Because the moment she was building toward wouldn't need a spotlight. It would only need a microphone. Capitol Hill that morning had the kind of stillness that feels like it's waiting for something to be broken. The kind of hum that buzzes under the surface. Not loud, not panicked, but watchful. Staffers murmured by the coffee stations. Interns filed papers without looking up. Reporters adjusted camera angles, expecting another routine vote, another round of procedural speeches that would barely graze the headlines. And then AOC walked in. No entourage, no blazer, just a steady stride and a single red folder pressed to her side like it held something both delicate and powerful. It wasn't thick, but it had weight, the kind that doesn't come from paper. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her aides followed behind, quieter than usual. One of them carried nothing. Another clenched a pen that hadn't yet clicked. A security guard at the side entrance nodded at her. Slightly more formal than usual, as if sensing the shift without understanding it. As she passed, two representatives in conversation fell silent for a beat, eyes glancing briefly toward the red folder before flicking back down to their notes. They didn't ask. She didn't offer. A journalist in the hallway leaned toward her producer. "Red folder. That mean anything?" The producer shrugged. "Could be personal. Could be nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Downstairs in the basement cafeteria, someone was already whispering, "She's up to something." Upstairs in a committee room, a junior staffer paused their email mid-sentence, distracted by the tone of the room. Just slightly different today. The House chamber had that pre-session shuffle, the clicking heels, shifting chairs, the slight echo of pages turning and coffee being sipped too quickly. It was Congress as usual until it wasn't. When AOC entered, a few heads turned automatically, then again with a second glance when they noticed her not holding a phone or briefing packet, but only that red folder. Simple, unmarked, intentional. She took her seat without fanfare, smoothed her skirt, placed the folder neatly on the desk in front of her, then folded her hands on top of it like someone sitting across from a question not yet asked. Across the aisle, a Republican lawmaker narrowed his eyes, then returned to his phone. A fellow Democrat leaned over and whispered, "You okay?" AOC gave a soft smile. "More than okay." That was the last thing she said for the next 15 minutes. Just waited, observed. Let the moment settle. She wasn't performing. She was preparing. And the room, though it didn't know why, felt it. The C-SPAN camera crew, half asleep a moment earlier, now shifted a little closer. Her aide stood at the back wall now, arms crossed, not out of defiance but protection, readiness, quiet loyalty. And in that small moment, where nothing had been spoken but everything had shifted, even the air in the chamber seemed to change. Less stale, more watchful, like history had taken one slow breath in and hadn't let it out yet, because they didn't know what was in the folder. But she did, and she knew that once it opened, the conversation would not return to what it was. Not today, not after this. The chamber had settled into its usual rhythm, paper rustling, low voices conferring, phones dimmed but always present. It was one of those routine sessions where the proceedings blurred into a polite murmur of motions and amendments. A few members tapped at their screens. A few more nodded off discreetly. C-SPAN rolled on in the background, unwatched by most but always recording. And then, almost quietly, AOC rose from her seat. No dramatic gesture, no raised voice. Just the simple act of standing and waiting to be recognized. The speaker glanced in her direction, nodded. "Madam Speaker," she began, calm but clear, "I'd like to enter into the record a document pertaining to the recent Flag Day event, specifically regarding federal spending and communication strategy." There was a pause, not because what she said was out of order, but because of how she said it. Measured, intentional, as if every word had been placed, not tossed. She unfolded a piece of paper slowly, and for a moment, it could have been anything. A local resolution, a memo from her district office. But as she spoke, the tone in the room shifted. The following excerpts are from an internal communications document originating from the White House press team, she said, dated 1 week prior to the event. A few heads lifted. She continued, not rushing. Primary camera focus. President, avoid wide shots when audience is sparse. Coordinate supporter wardrobe. Military and veteran apparel encouraged for visual consistency. Ensure donor zones appear full on screen. No formal confirmation required from Pentagon. Event to proceed as media-facing celebration, not military exercise. A rustle swept through the room. Not noise exactly, but the sound of postures shifting, eyes widening. One Republican member, seated 2 rows behind her, leaned toward a colleague and whispered audibly, "Is that real?" She didn't respond to the question. She kept reading, letting the words speak for themselves. Invite high-engagement influencer guests with veteran-adjacent branding for image amplification. Do not release full expenditure breakdown to press until after visuals have circulated. She paused, looked up briefly. "I enter this memo into the record not for spectacle," she said, "but because public trust deserves more than a parade of optics. It deserves receipts." There it was, soft but unmistakable. Across the aisle, a few expressions tightened. Others avoided eye contact. A handful stared straight ahead, faces unreadable. No one interrupted. She folded the page once, precisely, and handed it to the clerk. The document disappeared into the official record with a quiet slide, but the air it left behind was anything but quiet. Back in the corner, a young Capitol staffer blinked rapidly, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. She'd never seen a moment like that, not because it was loud or showy, but because it was careful. It was the kind of moment that didn't shout. It revealed. AOC sat back down without ceremony. She didn't glance around the room. She didn't smile. She simply reached for her notepad, jotted something down in the margin, and underlined it once. There were no fireworks, no raised voices, just a chamber learning, too late, that silence doesn't mean absence, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is read a truth that no one expected to become public, right into the record. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A few murmurs passed between Republican seats, half smiles, a quiet scoff here and there. One leaned into another and said, "Probably doctored." The kind of casual shrug often reserved for anything uncomfortable. They'd seen dramatics before, and usually things moved on. But this time, it didn't. AOC had returned to her seat quietly. No victory pose, no lingering glances, just a pen in hand, tracing a slow line in the margin of her notebook. And though she didn't say another word, the room around her was no longer relaxed. A stillness had crept in. It started with the phones, buzzing, lighting up, one after another. Not the usual updates, not reminders, but messages short and sharp. "We need to talk." "Who cleared this?" "Is that memo real?" Down the street, journalists were already making calls. Some had worked in communications themselves, knew the language of those internal memos well. The phrasing, the tone, the way certain words were used not to inform, but to direct perception. By the time one former staffer publicly confirmed, "Yes, that's how those are written. That's not fake," the energy in the chamber had changed completely. A few tried to regain footing. One member of the GOP stood up and suggested the document be flagged until verification could be completed. Said something about protecting the integrity of the record, but the words landed awkwardly, like a curtain drawn too late after the audience had already seen behind it. And outside, the story was moving faster than any press conference could catch. People weren't shouting. They were disappointed. A veteran from Ohio posted, "So we were props? All that gear, the salutes, just to fill a camera angle?" A nurse in Georgia wrote, "I watched that parade with my dad. He served, and now I see why he didn't clap." Still, AOC said nothing more. She didn't tweet, didn't pose for a follow-up. Just listened, wrote something else in her notebook, underlined it once, then twice. When later asked if she had intended to bring down Trump, she shook her head, not out of humility, but clarity. "It's not about taking him down," she said softly. "It's about lifting the truth up." And that quiet distinction, so small, yet so powerful, hung there longer than any headline. Because this wasn't about spectacle, it was about contrast. Between noise and truth, between performance and principle. And while some scrambled to spin, others sat still, finally hearing what had been said. Not because it was loud, but because it was real. It started with comments, not debate, not criticism, just noise. Loud, frantic, faceless. Her inbox began to swell with messages that didn't ask questions, didn't offer disagreement. They just spewed. Some came in all caps. Some used words meant only to sting. Traitor, communist, go back. A few were worse, and most didn't even pretend to be about policy. Then the headlines followed, not from the major networks, but from corners of the internet designed to mimic legitimacy. Pixelated logos, banners that pulsed red and blue, stories with titles like AOC's real donors revealed, Is she funded by enemies? Or Bronx Congresswoman mocks soldiers. Again. Of course, none of it was true. But truth wasn't the point. The aim wasn't to win an argument. It was to drown the room in static, loud enough, ugly enough, so that people would cover their ears before they ever heard what was actually said. And that's when it crossed a line. AOC was in her district office when the call came in. Her aide's face paled even before the words came out. There's a letter for your mom. It came this morning. It wasn't anonymous. That was the part that startled them most. Someone had signed a name, scrawled with just enough clarity to look intentional. The message wasn't long, but it said enough. Your daughter's mouth is going to get her hurt, and maybe you too. Capitol Police were alerted immediately. Within hours, additional officers were quietly reassigned. No sirens, no press conferences, just shadows in the hallway and quiet instructions for tighter door security. One of her younger aides looked shaken as she glanced at the windows, then back at AOC. We could scale back a little, she offered carefully. Maybe hold off on anything new until it settles down. Just for a few days. AOC didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, toward the street where buses hummed and school kids raced the stoplights with arms full of books. She thought of her mother, who used to carry 2 jobs just to keep a roof overhead, and of her neighbors, men who worked overnight shifts in hospital basements, women who made dinner stretch 3 days. None of them ever got to scale back. Not when it was hard, not when it was unfair. So she said it gently, not as a slogan, but as something closer to a memory. No, she said. That's what they want. The aide nodded slowly, understanding. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. Because this wasn't about a parade anymore. It never really was. It was about the price of telling the truth, especially when that truth made powerful people uncomfortable. And it was about what happened when one woman, without shouting, without flinching, chose to stand in the storm rather than duck beneath it. That week, she said little in public, but behind the scenes, her staff doubled their outreach. They pulled old records. They asked new questions. The wheels were still turning, quietly, deliberately, because when they go low, the instinct may be to shout, but sometimes power is clearest when spoken softly, and AOC had no intention of stepping back. Not now, not when the noise was loudest, because beneath the noise, something else had begun. People were listening. It began as a quiet stack on the edge of her desk. Just a few envelopes at first, white, creased, handwritten with care. The kind that slipped through the cracks in a world run by notifications. But by the end of the week, that stack had become a pile. And by the end of the next, the pile had become a table of its own. Most were simple. No return address, just names. First names. Michael. Teresa. J. One with just a tiny handprint traced in purple crayon and a smiley face below it. Her staff had tried to sort them, by state, by date, even by subject, but eventually gave up. The letters weren't for filing, they were for feeling. AOC found herself drawn to them late at night, long after the building had quieted down. Her office had the stillness of a library after closing, the kind of silence that doesn't demand anything, only invites. She opened the first envelope slowly, not out of hesitation, but reverence. Congresswoman, I'm a veteran, 3 tours, 2 prosthetics, 0 parades. You honored us more in 30 seconds than he did in 30 tanks. Thank you. Tom, Idaho. She paused. Her eyes drifted to the small cactus in the corner of her office window, a gift from a teacher back in Queens. She took a breath and opened the next. Dear AOC, I cried watching your clip. I cried because you made me feel seen. I'm a nurse, worked through the pandemic, watched so many fade alone. That's what patriotism looks like, quiet, honest, and kind. Bless you. Rosa, Michigan. She didn't wipe her tears. She let them fall where they wanted, on the desk, on her sweater sleeve, once even right onto the edge of a letter from a high school civics student who wrote, I want to be like you, but not famous, just brave. And there were more. A retired postal worker from Alabama, a single dad in rural Maine, a first-generation college student who said her grandmother finally believed politics mattered after watching The Woman with the Red Lipstick and Calm Voice. Some of the letters were funny. Some came with poems. A few had dog-eared photos tucked inside. Fathers in uniform, mothers in scrubs, Kids saluting the TV screen with crooked arms. But what bound them together wasn't politics. It wasn't sides. It wasn't slogans. It was gratitude. Gratitude not for the fight, but for the refusal to flinch, for the steadiness, for the stillness in a time that had felt so loud. She didn't read them all in one night. She couldn't. Not just because there were too many, but because each one asked to be held for a moment. Some deserved silence, others a whisper of thanks. And though she hadn't planned to reply, she started writing small notes back, just a line or two. Nothing official, just human. Because in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the trending clips, not the headlines or hashtags, but this quiet chorus of strangers, people who had nothing to gain by writing and yet chose to speak anyway. And in those late hours, surrounded by stacks of real voices, AOC didn't feel small. She felt connected. Like maybe the country wasn't so divided after all, just waiting for someone to hear it whisper. It was late, not just the kind of late that turns the office quiet, but the kind that slips past midnight unnoticed, where even the streetlights outside looked tired. In her office, the windows reflected the soft glow of a desk lamp. A cup of tea sat beside a pile of opened envelopes, some with scribbled ink, others typed, but all of them creased with care. The room smelled faintly of peppermint and paper. She didn't call a press conference. There was no announcement, no coordinated social media rollout. She simply opened the Instagram app, propped her phone on a ceramic mug, and pressed Go Live. No makeup, no backdrop. Just Alexandria, a loose sweater, the hum of a quiet night, and a half smile that carried something deeper than words. "Hey," she began softly, "it's just me." And some letters. At first, only a few hundred people tuned in, then a few thousand, then tens of thousands. The number ticked up so fast the hearts on the screen couldn't keep up. "They built a parade," she said, folding a letter gently in her lap. "I'm just reading the mail." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She held up one letter, its corners curled. "This one's from a retired nurse in Missouri." She said, "I've never written to anyone in Congress, but I saw that clip, and something inside me said, that's my America." Her eyes didn't well with tears, but her voice slowed, softened, as if giving each word a seat at the table. She read more. A letter from a janitor in North Carolina who said he'd never served in the military, but felt like dignity had finally been served on his behalf. A message from a teenage girl whose father, a Marine, had passed away, but who said AOC's words sounded like the kind of thing he would have said if he were still here. She didn't comment. She just let the words sit. Every so often, she sipped her tea. The steam fogged her glasses and she smiled through it. Not performative, just present. "Some people sent me statistics," she added after a pause. "Budget charts, breakdown of how much those tanks cost per minute." She tapped her notebook gently. "I'll use them. But tonight, it's the stories I want to hold." A silence followed, not awkward, but full. Thousands watched and kept watching, not because something explosive was happening, but because something honest was. It didn't trend because it was loud. It spread because it was steady. And in that moment, what had been a political firestorm began to shift. This wasn't rebuttal. It was reflection. AOC didn't attack. She didn't name names. She just held space. For others, for the forgotten, for those whose patriotism wasn't televised. And as the stream quietly ended, the screen faded to black with only 4 words written on a sticky note beside her. "We're still listening, always." The next morning, conservative outlets scrambled to respond, but nothing stuck. The more they tried to inflame, the more calm she seemed. The more venom they poured, the more the public leaned in, not to the noise, but to the voice that refused to shout. It wasn't a spectacle. It was something rarer. It was what happens when truth is given time and a voice is given trust. It was meant to be a routine session, the kind that drifts by quietly, small amendments, polite nods, eyes half focused on email screens, and coffee cups gone cold. No one expected anything more, and certainly not from her. AOC had been sitting quietly near the middle, pen tapping softly against her notebook, listening as others spoke. She wasn't scheduled to lead anything that day. But when she rose and gently asked the chair for just 5 minutes, most barely looked up. The room didn't fall silent at first. A few continued to type. One aide scrolled. A congressman beside her shifted in his seat, arms crossed with polite detachment. But then she began. Not with volume, not with fire, just presence. Mr. Chairman, she started, her tone clear, unhurried. With permission, I'd like to share something not on the docket, but in the air. Something in her voice made people pause. It wasn't dramatic, but it landed. One by one, heads began to lift. Eyes met hers. Not because of a title, but because of how she carried it. I've heard words like optics, performance, distraction, she continued. But what if we're asking the wrong question? A long breath. What if the issue isn't how things looked, but why they were arranged to look that way? You could hear the air conditioner humming. The shuffling had stopped. Even those usually quick to dismiss her seemed, if only for a moment, still. She didn't raise her voice, but each word moved with weight, like it had been sifted, chosen carefully. She held up a single page, not waved it, just showed it like you would a photograph of someone you respected. This is a memo from inside the communications office, not speculation, not commentary, a printed instruction. She read it line by line. Visual priority, president center frame. Use camouflage clothing to diversify support optics. Ensure donor delegation within top 2 camera rows. No flourish, no accusation. Just the words, allowed to stand on their own. I don't share this to shame, she said, voice steady. I share it because those who served our country deserve more than a backdrop. They deserve to be front and center, not just when it's convenient, but when it counts. One member from across the aisle blinked, then looked down. I've been called dramatic, she said, almost with a smile, but I think dignity has never been quiet. It just waits for its turn. No one interrupted her. There was nothing to interrupt. And when she gently handed the page to the clerk for the record, the room didn't erupt. It deepened, like something heavy had been placed, not dropped, into the middle of the chamber. It wasn't a takedown. It wasn't a show. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full. And as she sat down without a glance at the reactions around her, one thing became clear to even her loudest critics. She hadn't come to perform. She had come to frame the truth. And in a place so used to noise, it was the quiet that began to echo. The stillness from earlier hadn't left. It lingered in the space between her words, as if the room itself didn't quite know how to return to its usual rhythm. AOC adjusted the mic gently. She didn't rush. I know it's easier to clap for jets than to vote for dental care, she said, her voice calm. Even. Easier to cheer a parade than to look a veteran in the eye and explain why he still can't chew his meals properly. A few in the chamber shifted, but no one interrupted. I met a former Marine outside this building last month, she continued. He served in 2 deployments, came home with chronic pain and missing teeth. The VA told him it would be another 6 months, just for an appointment. She let the silence breathe again. And when I asked what he was eating, he laughed, told me he sticks to soup and mashed potatoes, said he's used to it now. She looked out over the rows of seats. That man watched the tanks roll down Constitution Avenue last week. He told me they looked shiny, said the gold cart was funny. A soft pause. He didn't sound angry. That's what broke my heart the most. He sounded used to being forgotten. There was no drama in her delivery, just clarity. Like someone finally turning on the light in a hallway people had grown comfortable walking through in the dark. Then she shifted, not in tone, but in focus. I got a letter from a teacher in Nevada, she said. Middle school. She wrote that she brings paper towels from home because the school budget ran out. Her students had to use napkins for a week. A low breath escaped from somewhere behind her. Maybe disbelief, maybe shame. We had money for confetti, for camera angles, but not for paper towels. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. This isn't about red or blue, she said. It's about whether we've started confusing performance for principle. Her hands rested quietly on the podium. She wasn't trying to rile anyone, but the weight of her words did it anyway. I've been told I'm too loud, too bold, too direct, that I should learn to play the game. She paused just long enough for the next part to land. But I didn't run for Congress to smile for cameras. Then her voice dropped, just slightly. I came to tell the truth. A stir moved across the room, not loud but unmistakable. The kind that came not from outrage, but recognition. She let her gaze settle on the chamber, not defiant, just unwavering. And if truth makes me radical, she said, her voice gentle but steady, I'll wear that like a badge. She didn't wait for applause, she wasn't expecting any. She just folded her notes, stepped down, and returned to her seat. No flourish, no mic drop. Just a quiet woman, holding a louder kind of conviction than most dared speak aloud. The moment she stepped off the floor, the ripple had already begun. It didn't crash like a wave. It whispered first, like a question asked in private that somehow finds its way into a crowded room. Someone posted a clip on Twitter, just 60 seconds, no edits, no hashtags. Then someone else added subtitles. Then someone stitched in photos of veterans sleeping outside VA clinics. Within the hour, the phrase, "not here to smile for cameras," trended on every major platform. On TikTok, a young veteran posted a quiet video from his truck, staring into the distance before saying, I didn't think anyone saw us, but today, someone did. On Instagram, a teacher filmed her classroom supply shelf, half empty, dented, and added, You don't forget a voice that remembers you? By the time AOC returned to her office, the clip had circled the globe. A producer at MSNBC texted one of her aides, Did you plan that? But there was nothing planned. No soundbite strategy. No rally cry rehearsed. It was just what needed to be said. Even Fox News, usually quick to downplay or distort, aired the full clip, begrudgingly. At first, their commentators tried to pivot. Well, the parade was still a patriotic event. But one panelist, a retired Navy captain, broke the rhythm. Look, he said, squinting at the screen, you can disagree with her policies. That's your right. But when someone speaks truth about veterans and broken systems, maybe it's time to stop spinning and start listening. It was the only clip from the segment that made it to their YouTube channel. That night on CNN, a retired colonel sat across from a host who'd spent the last 3 days covering the fallout of Paradegate. His voice was calm, his uniform absent, but the gravity hadn't left him. That wasn't a speech, and he said, adjusting his glasses. That was a mirror. The host blinked. A mirror? He nodded slowly. She didn't tell us anything we don't already know. She just said it in a room where too many pretend not to hear it. Back in the Bronx, AOC scrolled through some of the reactions. Not many, just enough to know something had landed. A few old friends from her barista days had messaged, people she hadn't heard from in years. One said, You sounded like you were still behind that counter, just with a better mic. She smiled softly. Her mother called too. This time, not with worry in her voice, but pride. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. In the morning, the local paper ran a story above the fold. Not about the threats, not about the partisan noise, but about the letters, the handwritten notes, the slow, quiet avalanche of real people simply saying thank you. The paper's title read, When One Voice Was Louder Than a Parade. And maybe that's what stayed with her the most, not the trending hashtags or studio invitations or pundits' unexpected praise, but the soft hum underneath it all. That somehow, in a world so noisy, a voice that didn't yell had still been heard. The kind of voice that didn't need a spotlight. Just a moment. Just truth. And for once, the room had listened. It didn't begin with a press conference. Just a short line tucked into the afternoon schedule. Introduction of proposed legislation, H.R. 4517, Veterans First and Federal Transparency Act. No flashy banners, no camera-ready backdrop. AOC simply walked into the chamber with a manila folder tucked under one arm and a quiet resolve that had grown louder over the past few weeks. The bill itself was straightforward. Audit all federal spending on non-essential ceremonial events. Require disclosure of donors and private sponsors. And most importantly, redirect portions of those funds towards streamlining the backlog of care at Veterans Affairs hospitals, especially for mental health and dental services. It was a bill written not for headlines, but for people who rarely made them. She stood at the podium, voice calm but steady, and read the short opening statement she'd written at 2 a.m. the night before. This isn't about parades or partisanship. It's about promises. Promises we've made to those who served, and the quiet ways we break them when we think no one's watching. The room was half empty, as it often was when something real was said. And yet, something shifted. The headlines the next morning didn't quite know what to do with it. One cable host called it performative. A think tank advisor referred to it as another left-wing jab cloaked in patriotism. Online trolls recycled the usual labels. But something different was happening beneath the noise. Veterans groups started sharing the PDF. A VA nurse in Phoenix tweeted, "Finally, someone in Congress noticed our 8-month appointment wait times." A post on Reddit's ERCHAR Veterans thread began trending with the title, "This bill isn't perfect, but damn, it's a start." In a small American Legion post in Pennsylvania, 3 vets read the bill aloud at the bar. One of them, a retired sergeant, shook his head after the 3rd page. "No one ever thinks about dental," he muttered, "but try eating on one side of your mouth for 6 years. It didn't go viral overnight. It wasn't meant to. It grew like roots, quiet, stubborn, and strong. Inside the Capitol, opposition grew too. Some lawmakers mocked the bill as a woke audit. Others filed amendments that stripped its teeth, leaving behind only ceremonial language. One representative tried to replace the phrase federal vanity events with civic patriotic showcases. AOC didn't clap back. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she met with veterans, some in her office, some over Zoom, some quietly waiting outside hearings with folded letters in hand. She asked questions. She listened. She rewrote parts of the bill herself, pen scratching late into the night. Her staff worried. "We're in a media storm already," one aide said. "Should we wait?" AOC looked up from her laptop, eyes soft but firm. "No," she said. "Storms make things grow." A quiet groundswell began. Churches included her speech in Sunday bulletins. A group of Gold Star mothers mailed hand-signed endorsements to every House member. In a Boston library, a group of high schoolers launched a petition with 200,000 signatures in 4 days. And yet she stayed steady. In a handwritten letter slipped under her office door, a Marine Corps veteran wrote, "I don't care who you voted for or what cable news says about you. If this bill helps even one guy like me not wait a year for his PTSD meds, it's worth everything." AOC read that letter twice, folded it carefully, and slid it into the side pocket of her bag, where she kept things that reminded her why she showed up in the first place. The vote wasn't scheduled yet, and the political winds were uncertain. But outside the chamber, far from sound bites and spin, a different conversation had begun. And it wasn't about her. It was about what we owed to those who came home in pieces, and whether we'd rather fix the foundation or keep painting the parade. There was no grand press tour, no official campaign announcement, just a folded itinerary on the kitchen counter with 3 words scribbled across the top. Show up, listen, repeat. That's how the town halls began. First was a small VFW hall in upstate New York. The ceilings were low, the coffee was strong, and the air smelled faintly of floor wax and stories that had been told one too many times. AOC stood near the end of a long folding table, her sleeves rolled up, her tone softer than usual, not because she was afraid, but because she knew she was on someone else's turf. "Not everyone here agrees with me," she began, smiling gently. "And that's okay. I'm not here to perform. I'm here to learn." The questions were honest, sometimes sharp, sometimes wrapped in pain so old it had calcified into cynicism. But she didn't flinch. In North Carolina, a widow of a Vietnam vet handed her a wrinkled medical bill and said, "I don't want politics. I just want to know why they won't cover what killed him." In Nevada, a 22-year-old who served in Afghanistan stood up and said, "You're the first person in Congress I've seen show up without cameras first." In rural Ohio, the room was tense, mostly men in flannel and boots, the kind of crowd that could smell inauthenticity a mile away. When AOC walked in, someone muttered under their breath, "She's just here for a soundbite." But an hour in, something changed. She sat across from a man with a deep scar across his left jaw, who wore his red Trump 2020 cap like armor. He didn't say much until the very end. "I still don't agree with you," he said quietly, "but I believe you." She nodded slowly, as if holding the weight of that sentence with care. Not everyone clapped, but no one laughed either. The next stop was a cramped American Legion in Arizona, where the air conditioning wheezed more than it worked. There, an older veteran held up a prescription bottle and said, "I waited 7 months for this. I only got it because my daughter threatened to film the next visit." AOC asked if she could hold the bottle. When he handed it over, their hands touched for just a second, just long enough to remind them both that this wasn't theoretical. She didn't promise miracles, just a little more sunlight on the system, and maybe eventually some heat. Her staff traveled with her, tired, overworked, but moved. They recorded testimonies with permission. They jotted notes on paper when phones ran out of charge. One aide started a private Google Doc titled, "What They Never Say on TV." The news barely covered any of it. No splashy headlines, no studio debates. But the rooms were full, not of fans, but of citizens who had more stories than votes, more hope than trust. In Wisconsin, a veteran who'd once protested her called her the most unlikely ally. In Georgia, a conservative grandmother baked peach cobbler for the whole hall, saying, "It's not about red or blue. It's about whether you're brave enough to come here in the first place." Each stop added a different kind of silence, the thoughtful kind, the kind that doesn't need applause to matter. One evening, after the last hall in Iowa, AOC sat alone in the back of a church basement turned meeting room. She wrote in her journal, "They don't need me to win the argument. They need me to hold the door open." Outside, the sky was starting to fade from gold to indigo. She packed her notes, pulled on her coat, and stepped back into the wind, tired, grounded, and more certain than ever that truth didn't shout. It showed up, and then it stayed. It started, as many quiet revolutions do, in a classroom. In a small public middle school just outside Des Moines, the morning announcements had barely finished echoing through the hallway speakers when Ms. Heller wheeled a cart into her 8th grade civics class. On top, a stack of printed transcripts, each neatly stapled, each labeled at the top. Remarks, Congressional Record, July 9th. Her students didn't know yet what they were about to read. They expected another day of textbook chapters and bullet points on the whiteboard. But instead, she handed out the pages and said, "Today we're reading something that wasn't written in a textbook. It was spoken, out loud, in the chamber, and it changed the temperature of the room." It was AOC's speech, the one about parades and priorities, about veterans and forgotten promises, the one that didn't go viral for its volume but for its weight. At first, some students read it like they would any school assignment, scanning for key phrases, marking unfamiliar words. But slowly, something shifted. Heads stopped bobbing toward the clock. Pens stopped tapping. By the end of the second page, one student raised his hand and asked, "Wait, this is real?" Ms. Heller just nodded. Then she gave them a prompt. "Write about what courage looks like in public life. And don't think too hard, just be honest." The essays came in the next morning, folded, handwritten, typed. Some were 3 lines long, others spilled onto the backs of the pages. One girl wrote, "She talked about stuff people avoid." That's brave. A boy wrote, "I never thought someone in Congress even knew what a teacher pays for paper towels." Another, in big block letters, simply wrote, "She wasn't trying to be famous. She was trying to be fair." Ms. Heller read that one 3 times before gently placing it at the top of her pile. Later that week, she sent a photo of the essay to AOC's office, not expecting a reply. Not really. Just wanting her to know that her words had landed somewhere real, that they had become something more than a clip or a tweet. She didn't tell her students she'd done it, not until the envelope came back. It was plain, with a return address from Washington. Inside, a single page, typed, signed. AOC had read the essay, and in her note she wrote, "Sometimes we speak into rooms where we're not sure anyone is truly listening. Please tell your student, I heard her, and I needed her words more than she knows." When Ms. Heller read the letter aloud in class, the room went completely still. No snickers, no groans. Just that rare silence that only comes when something sinks in before anyone knows what to do with it. Later that day, the girl who wrote the line about fairness stayed behind after the bell. "She actually read it?" she asked, unsure if she believed it. Ms. Heller smiled and handed her the letter. "She didn't just read it, she carried it." The student looked down, then quietly asked, "Does that mean I could do that too? Like, speak and people listen?" "You just did," her teacher said. Elsewhere, the country kept arguing about parades, about truth, about what counted as patriotism. But in one Iowa classroom, the conversation shifted, not because anyone won, but because someone had cared enough to show up, speak honestly, and leave space for others to speak back. And when the student went home that day, she didn't tell her parents everything. Just this: "We read something brave today. And for the first time, I saw someone who looked like she was listening, like really listening, even through the page." That night, AOC sat by her window in Queens, reading the scanned copy of the student's words again. She closed her notebook slowly and whispered almost to herself, "If all of this reached just one girl in Iowa, maybe that's enough for today." The committee meeting had ended without fireworks, just routine notes, motions passed with tired nods, staffers whispering reminders as folders were gathered and chairs pushed back in slow rhythm. It was the kind of late afternoon on the Hill where even the fluorescent lights seemed to sigh. AOC moved through the narrow corridor outside the hearing room, holding her binder close to her chest. The hallway buzzed with the usual low conversations, some about votes, some about dinner. She wasn't in a hurry. These moments after meetings always felt strange. Not quite public, not quite private, like a stage being reset. That was when she noticed him. He had waited, just far enough down the hallway to be intentional, but not enough to attract attention. A senior Republican, someone who'd been in Congress since before she graduated high school. They rarely spoke beyond formalities. Their worlds overlapped, but never truly touched. But now he stepped forward, not brash, not performative, just steady, like a man carrying a thought that had been sitting too long in his coat pocket. She met his eyes. Neutral, open. He cleared his throat lightly. "I hated the parade too," he said. His voice was low. "The kind you use when you want to be heard, but only by one person. I just couldn't say it." There was no anger in his tone, no self-pity either. Just a weariness that had clearly settled in his bones after years of pretending not to notice the things he'd always noticed. AOC didn't respond right away. She didn't try to reassure him or turn the moment into something bigger than it was. She just nodded, gently, as if to say, "I heard you, that's enough." For a second, the hallway felt quieter, not just because the chatter had shifted further down, but because something unspoken had been shared. Not agreement, not alliance, just a glimpse of honesty. And sometimes that was more surprising than conflict. He didn't stay long. A small nod back. Then he walked on. She stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of his words find their place in the folds of her day. The truth was, she had long understood that many people didn't actually disagree. They were just afraid to be the first voice in the room, and maybe even more afraid to be the last one still standing. Back in her office a few minutes later, she made tea. No headlines had been written about that conversation, no tweets. But in the margins of her notebook, between policy notes and to-do lists, she jotted a sentence. Not everyone clapping believed it. Some were just trying to survive the noise. She learned early that power didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered behind closed doors and hoped no one was listening. Other times it showed up in the smallest cracks, like a hallway confession too soft to echo. She closed the notebook and glanced out the window. Beyond the buildings and traffic, she could just make out the flag still waving above the Capitol dome, the same one that had stood during parades, protests, and too many speeches to count. It waved not for the loudest person in the room, but for the ones who kept showing up anyway. And that, she thought, was the quiet truth they couldn't stage manage. It had been a long week, maybe longer than she realized, the kind of stretch where every minute is accounted for, but none of them feel like they truly belong to her. But now, back home in the Bronx, she sat at the small kitchen table where she used to do her homework, her elbows brushing the edge of the plastic lace tablecloth her mother still insisted on keeping. Steam curled up from a chipped mug of café con leche. The sun had set early behind the apartment buildings, and the only light came from the warm, yellow glow above the stove. It wasn't quiet, not really. Someone's music played faintly from another floor. A baby cried in a neighbor's unit. A siren echoed 2 blocks away. But to her, it felt like stillness. Her mother had gone to bed early, leaving behind a plate of rice and beans covered with foil. A familiar comfort. But tonight, AOC wasn't hungry, not yet. Instead, she opened the folder in front of her. Letters neatly stacked, some typed, most handwritten, some shaky, some scrawled across lined notebook paper like someone had grabbed the first thing they could find. She hadn't planned to read any tonight, but her hand moved on its own, flipping through until one envelope caught her eye. No return address, just a bold pen stroke that read, "For Representative, Ocasio-Cortez," from a father. She unfolded it carefully. The letter was short, a gold star father. His son had died in Afghanistan. He wrote that he had watched the parade and felt nothing, no closure, no pride, just noise. And then, he wrote, he heard her words, not at a rally, not behind a podium, but during a quiet TV segment, and he felt for the first time in a long time, like someone in power had seen the silence he carried. She read it twice. Then wordlessly, she reached into the back of the folder and pulled out another letter, one she knew by touch. Her abuela's handwriting, neat but soft, like the edges of a well-worn prayer card. It was in Spanish, a note she'd sent years ago when AOC had first run for office. No estás sola. Tú vienes de mujeres fuertes. Solo recuerda por qué empezaste. You are not alone. You come from strong women. Just remember why you started. Without quite thinking, she slipped both letters into the same clear sleeve, side by side. 2 voices, one from a father who had lost a child to war, one from a grandmother who had raised children through hardship, neither asking for recognition, both reminding her what mattered. She sat still for a long time. No grand gestures, just breathing, just being. There were battles ahead, there always were. Votes to win, narratives to untangle, truths to defend. But in that quiet kitchen, with the Bronx outside and the letters resting in her hands, she didn't feel like a congresswoman or a headline or a trending clip. She felt like a thread in something much older, something stitched together not by titles, but by people who kept going, quietly, stubbornly, lovingly, even when the noise told them to stop. She looked up at the kitchen window, catching her own reflection faintly mirrored in the glass. No cameras, no script. Just a girl at her mother's table, holding on to the words that made her stronger. And slowly, without fanfare, she smiled. She sat alone on the small balcony, the quietest corner of her apartment. Below, the Bronx never really slept. A bus hissed around a sharp curve, a neighbor laughed too loud into her phone, and somewhere down the block, a vintage song drifted faintly from a cracked open window. On her lap rested the folder she had flipped through countless times over the past few nights. Not because the contents had changed, but because each time she saw something new. A carefully chosen word, a phrase designed to look harmless but meant to distract. Another quiet mark of what they'd hoped no one would notice. Beside it sat her old notebook, the one where she'd first scribbled, "Let them talk first. Then we bring the receipts." She hadn't known then how far those receipts would go, not just in exposing what happened, but in making people stop and see and feel. The evening breeze brushed past her hair, carrying with it the scent of dinner from a nearby kitchen. Rice, garlic, maybe oregano. It smelled like home. She leaned back against the railing, eyes unfocused, listening inward more than out. The city didn't need her attention right now, but the letters did. Letters from veterans, from teachers, from single moms, from people whose voices had never filled the chamber floor, but who had always existed, quietly, persistently, truthfully. She remembered the veteran in Ohio who looked her straight in the eye and said, "I still don't agree with you, but I believe you." She remembered the wobbly handwriting of a fifth grader in Iowa. She wasn't trying to be famous. She was trying to be fair. She couldn't reply to them all, couldn't shake every hand. But she had read them. She had heard them. And maybe that, in itself, was enough. A voice, steady and gentle, rose within her, unrehearsed but certain. A kind of answer not just to this chapter, but to a much older question about what change really looks like. They bought a spectacle. I carried a receipt. And maybe, just maybe, that's how history changes. One page, one voice, one undeniable truth at a time. She rose, closed the notebook, and stepped quietly back inside. No fireworks, no final push to convince anyone. Just the simple act of protecting truth from being lost in the noise of applause, meant for the wrong things. And just like that, the night moved on, softly, like a page waiting to be turned. Thank you for this journey. What moves me most in this story isn't just the political courage. It's the quiet kind of conviction that doesn't ask for a stage. AOC's refusal to match spectacle with noise, her choice to answer outrage with clarity, reminds us that real leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes it's measured. Sometimes it's just showing up with receipts when others only offer distraction. This wasn't a takedown. It was a reminder that integrity, though slower, quieter, often less glamorous, can still shift the room, and perhaps even the course of things. In a world addicted to performance, is there still room for truth told gently? What's one quiet truth in your life that's shaped you more than any applause ever could? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.